All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to do a very quick review of agriculture that we talked about in our last big topic. We were talking about populations. And we are going to discuss very quickly husbandry and how that relates to how we use resources. So we are doing two standards that are associated with these topics. We are looking at 5B2 and 5C2. 5B2 looks at designing systems to provide land access, and C2 looks at the use of chemical fertilizers and pesticides and the impact that those have on aquatic resources. So by the end of this lecture, you should be able to identify methods of livestock production, including husbandry and industrial livestock growth, identify and explain environmental problems associated with maintaining livestock lands, describe methods used to maintain land quality, including fertilization and pest control, identify and explain environmental problems associated with fertilization and pest control of agriculture, explain the ways in which different pesticides work to reduce the impact of pests, and explain how integrated pest management works to reduce pests and negate harmful environmental impacts. So some of these we're going to touch on more briefly in this particular lecture. We will refer back to this and come back with a little bit more detail, especially with the pest control when we start talking about toxicity and toxicology in Unit 5. So very quickly, we're going to do a review of agriculture. So if you remember, there are two basic types of agriculture that we talk about, subsistence and industrial. Subsistence agriculture is typically done by a single family or a farm for the purpose of feeding themselves. They may have surplus, they may take it to a farmer's market, but profit is not the goal. And subsistence is typically more extensive, meaning that it requires more land, more labor. And subsistence tends to use more of the sustainable methods, such as polyculture, alley cropping, and crop rotation. Industrial agriculture is typically done by a group of individuals or a business for the purpose of making profit. So you're talking about producing large amounts of product on a very small unit of land. Meaning that it tends to be intensive, lots of use of fossil fuels, a small amount of land, lots of things that are being put out. In industrial agriculture, we are going to call, in those we're going to include plantations, and we're talking about a lot of those large corporate farms that are found in the American Midwest. Recently, there has been a push toward more sustainable agriculture, not just in soil-based sustainable agriculture, but also being able to use what is called aquaponics. And aquaponics is using a water medium to grow plants. So rather than putting them in the soil, you're going to grow them in a water-based system. Typically, these tend to be relatively small plants, so it's not normally done on an industrial scale, but it is more sustainable. You can produce some vegetables such as tomatoes and lettuce, and they grow almost as well or as well in an aquaponic system as they do in a soil-based system. And in the aquaponic system, you have a recycled water system that uses natural biogeochemical cycles to replenish nutrients as the water moves through the process. So there's our very quick review of agriculture. We're going to step very quickly into talking about how do we deal with pests. So whether you're on a family farm or an industrial farm, one of the things that has to be talked about is the impact that pests have on yield. So we're going to identify a pest as any organism that competes with a human being for food, invades our homes, destroys our buildings, spreads disease, or just causes us annoyance. So it's interesting to note that among those organisms that we define as pests, only about 100 species are causing the largest problems. And so these pests really become big issues when we notice that we have disrupted the local ecosystem. Natural systems don't really have the concept of a pest because there are predator prey relationships and other symbiotic relationships that keep insect populations or other organism populations in control. So, since the rise of agriculture, particularly industrial agriculture in the late 50s, we have developed specific methods of control for pests. And the most common control method has been the pesticide. So these are often organic or synthetic in nature, depending on whether they are a first generation pesticide, one of the earlier ones created, or whether they are a second generation pesticide, some of the newer ones that are synthetic and are derivatives of those first generations. The catch all term is a pesticide. It is something that is designed to get rid of a pest. We can also break them down into smaller categories, and those smaller categories are specific to what it's trying to kill. So we're looking at herbicides for plants, fungicides for fungi, insecticides for insects, and rodenticides for rodents. Fumigants tend to be large scale. They're not very targeted to one specific type of organism. They're the kind of catch all, whatever you put it on, it will kill it. One of the big problems with pesticides is it puts us on this thing that's called the resistance treadmill, in which a pesticide is applied. Some pests survive it, they develop a resistance to it. And as those organisms that are resistant continue to reproduce, they therefore pass their resistance on to their offspring. More insects are resistant to a particular pesticide. Therefore, we have to develop a new pesticide to get rid of those. The process continues, goes on, goes on. There are two major laws that we have that regulate pesticide use. The first is the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, also known as FIFRA. And FIFRA requires that the EPA, USDA, and FDA determine whether the active ingredients in pesticides are harmful or not. Unfortunately, at this point, only about 10% of the active ingredients that are out there have been identified and studied, and those not even very thoroughly. And the problem is we're looking at thousands upon thousands of active ingredients that we're looking at. Additionally, we have the Food Quality Protection Act, which requires EPA to reduce the allowed levels on pesticides by a factor of 10, especially if there is absolutely no safety data on the active ingredient of a pesticide that's used on a plant. We will talk again later about specific kinds of pesticides in terms of giving names to specific chemicals and talking about how they do what they do. For right now, you do not need to worry about that very much. So how should we deal with pests? We should deal with pests using this process called integrated pest management. And integrated pest management requires more expert knowledge of how to get rid of a specific pest in a specific area. However, it is it's expensive in the beginning, but it can pay off in the long run in that it is a much healthier ecosystem, and it helps to have beneficial insects doing a lot of the work for you. So here you'll see the different ways in which integrated pest management works. And really you're looking at starting at the bottom with the most desired method of getting rid of the pest, moving up this pyramid to the least desired. Now, integrated pest management does allow the use of chemical pesticides, but only under very specific instances. You're going to look more about these cultural sanitation things, how you plant, where you plant, when you plant. Some physical things that you can do, such as spraying hot water, moving your field to a different area, biological methods of introducing beneficial insects, introducing natural predators. And then finally, chemical is your last resort. Unfortunately, as we stand now, chemical tends to be the first resort for getting rid of pests. Right, so we're going to shift gears from talking about agriculture. We're going to move into animal husbandry. And animal husbandry is simply the management of domesticated animals. And we manage those domesticated animals for the purpose of using their products. So that might be eggs from a chicken, wool from a sheep, milk from a cow, or meat from all of the above. Most commonly, we're talking about maintaining cattle, pigs, and chickens. Those tend to be the most common across the board, whether we're talking about family or industrial animal growth. Other ones that we tend to see are goats and sheep, which are called ruminant animals, and also fish. So when we talk about animal husbandry, we're looking at putting animals on one of three areas. If we're talking industrial animal husbandry, we're talking most commonly about putting animals in what's called a CAFO, C-A-F-O. If you'll remember from Food Inc., we did see one of those in the film. That is called a Central Animal Feeding Operation. That's what the CAFO stands for. And here you have these cattle, most commonly, are kept in a specific penned-in area where they don't typically move very much and they are fed corn. If we're talking free-range animals or more free-range animals, we're looking at either on a rangeland, which is a non-fenced-in area that tends to be minimally managed, or a pasture, which is a fenced-in, heavily managed area that sometimes is planted with a cover crop for the animals to eat. When we look at raising animals such as cattle, horses, in these areas, our big problem that we have to worry about is overgrazing. And what happens in overgrazing is when the animals eat too much of the grass, or the clover, or the alfalfa, the animals are not, the grass, excuse me, is not able to grow back and replace itself. Typical grass that is found on a rangeland or in a pasture has what is called a metabolic reserve. If you look at this picture here on the left top of your screen, the metabolic reserve is basically the bottom half of that particular plant. Most pasture grasses have what's called basal growth, B-A-S-A-L, meaning they grow from the bottom rather from the tip of the grass. So in order to maintain a healthy pasture, the bottom portion of the grass needs to remain intact so that it can grow back. When that metabolic reserve is depleted, you have what's called overgrazing. The grass will die. If you see here, here is a great example of an overgrazed field. So you see here, very little growth, a lot of you see mostly soil. Here you're looking more at one that's almost ready to be declared as overgrazed. One of the most common ways and best ways to avoid overgrazing is what is called rotational grazing. What you do in rotational grazing is you separate your field into areas and you rotate their grazing time from one field to another, never letting them stay too long in one place. That prevents the metabolic reserve from being depleted and therefore allows the grass to grow back. In recent years, we're also doing what's called fish husbandry. And here I'm going to show you relatively quickly different methods of growing fish or raising fish. So I'm going to start here at the very top where you see the trawler. So bottom trawling is when a boat is going to drag a weighted net along the bottom of the ocean, often in your coastal or shallow areas. You're going to get a good number of organisms in there. Unfortunately, you're going to destroy a lot of your key ecosystems on the bottom of the ocean, as well as gathering large amounts of what's called bycatch. And bycatch are organisms that are caught by accident. They are not the targeted organism, but they're still caught. And the majority of bycatch, by the time it gets on the boat, is dead or dying, and it's typically just thrown back overboard. So we have your bottom trawling here. The second one that we have is called long lining. And with a long line, the boat is dragging this elongated buoyed line. And that line is typically sometimes 60 miles long. And it has hundreds, sometimes even thousands of baited hooks on the bottom. That will catch specific kinds of fish if you use specific baits. Unfortunately, there is a large amount of bycatch that comes with long lining. And the most common bycatch on a long line is a sea turtle. Next, you have what's called the drift net. And the drift net is when a boat drags an elongated net that is typically 40 miles long and hanging about 15 feet below the surface, that is baited. And the drift net tends to entangle organisms by the gills. Therefore, they typically drown before they actually get pulled up onto the boat. And large amounts of bycatch here. Again, you'll see your sea turtles popping in there. The fourth type is here at the top. This is called the Persian method. And the Persian method, what happens there is you have a spotter plane that looks for schools of fish. And when that particular school of fish is found, the boat encircles that population with what's called a drawstring net and gathers those organisms together to pull them up onto the boat. This is one of the better methods in terms of bycatch. It doesn't have a whole lot. However, it does pick up a lot of surface-dwelling organisms such as seabirds and dolphins. Then you have what's called the surface cage, which you'll see up here in the very top corner. And the surface cage is when a chosen population is either driven into a predetermined cage area or grown in that area. So they're managed there until they're deemed large enough to use. There's a similar method of this called deep sea caging, which is exactly the same with the exception of it's for deep sea fish. And with both of those, they tend to reduce your wild breeding populations drastically. The last thing that we have that we see recently is the development of aquaculture, where animals are grown in enclosed pens their entire lives. There's no bycatch associated with it. However, it is very expensive. So when we talk about fishing, we have to worry about overfishing. So when a particular population has been depleted, there's no more of them left. The best way to avoid overfishing is to use what's called the precautionary principle. And that requires that the numbers of the organisms that are taken from the population are lower than the number that is required to maintain a breeding stock. So basically, you are fishing under your optimum sustainable yield. And that can help avoid what's called commercial extinction, where it becomes more expensive to find and catch an organism than it is worth in profit. Please forgive the very long lecture today. There was some important information that we had to get through. You should now be able to look back at these specific objectives and be able to identify and explain those concepts.